All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope that you had a restorative break or enjoyed some virtual socializing. We are going to jump into our next session, which is our first round of lightning talks of the 2021 RDAP Summit. So just to start with some logistics, once again, just as a reminder, this is a Zoom webinar, of course. All attendees are muted and your cameras are turned off. To ask a question, please use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. This session will run from noon to 12:50 with the last 10 minutes reserved for a Q&A. We also, of course, still have our Discord server set up for more informal conversations that will run throughout the summit. So please feel free to continue the discussion or conversation on that platform. Again, the Research Data Access and Preservation Summit organizers are very committed to providing an environment where all attendees can participate fully in the program and activities without fear of harassment or discriminatory behavior of any kind. Please report any violations by contacting COC officers in Discord or emailing codeofconduct@rdapassociation.org or by completing the incident form that is pinned in the Discord Code of Conduct thread. So with that being said, I am going to start the series of 8 lightning talks. And they are pre-recorded, so bear with me 1 minute. I'm gonna do some screen finagling and pull that up for you all.
Welcome to my lightning talk, Data Visualizations for Everybody, a lesson on accessibility. My name is Nancy Shin, and I will be your presenter today. I'm also the Network at the National Library of Medicine Pacific Northwest Region Research and Data Coordinator at the University of Washington in Seattle. Now let's have a look at today's agenda. Today's agenda is simple and straightforward. First thing we'll do is address the question, what is web accessibility and digital inclusion? Then we'll look at who benefits from accessible data visualizations. And finally, we'll look at the 6 easy ways to make your data visualization accessible. So what do we mean by web accessibility and digital inclusion? According to the World Wide Web Consortium's W3C, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, which is the gold standard in web accessibility guidance, web accessibility means that, and I quote, websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. People can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web and contribute to the web. Web accessibility encompasses all disabilities that affect access to the web, including auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, and visual, end quote. Web accessibility is part of digital inclusion, which refers to how website browsers, apps, and other digital infrastructure can be used by people with auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, and visual disabilities. The next question I ask you is who benefits from accessible data visualizations? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. Web accessibility benefits people with disabilities, be it a permanent, temporary, or situational disability. It also benefits people without permanent disabilities in the following ways. For example, it benefits people with temporary disabilities, such as someone who's lost their glasses or someone who may have broken their arm. In the same way, it also benefits people with situational disabilities, such as someone in bright sunlight or someone in a place where listening to audio can be challenging. And lastly, accessible data visualization can also benefit people with slow internet connections or who have limited or expensive bandwidths. Now that we know what web accessibility is and who benefits from it, how can we design with accessibility in mind? There are 6 easy ways to make your data visualization accessible. The first is to add alternative text or alt text to your images and charts. Alternative text is displayed when the image cannot be. Screen readers, which are the assistive technology used by people who are visually impaired, read the alternative text out loud. Do have valuable, descriptive, and succinct alt text. Don't use alt text that is vague and non-descriptive like Figure 4 JPEG. Good alt text includes one sentence that identifies the chart type, and it should also have a corresponding data table for the associated bar chart, pie chart, or line chart data. The second way to make your data visualization accessible is do use a takeaway title that includes the meaning of the visualization or point. With takeaway titles, people know instinctively what to look for in the data when they read the graph takeaway first as it appears in the title. Don't use vague and undescriptive titles. The third way to make your data visualization accessible is to label data directly as much as possible. Do directly label your data rather than using legends. This will be particularly helpful for people who are colorblind or who have low vision, where they might experience some difficulty matching colors within the plot to those described in the legend. In general, don't use a legend or a key to solely explain your graph or chart. The fourth way to make your data visualization accessible is to look for a font type and color contrast. A color palette contrast evaluation tool can be found at the WebAIM website, which is hyperlinked on this slide. In general, do use good contrast and a readable font size. Don't use poor contrast and small font sizes. The fifth way to make your data visualization accessible is do use linear and logical layouts. Don't use or make complex layouts or menus. And the sixth and final way to make your data visualization accessible is do use white space judiciously. Judicious use of white space increases the readability by helping to distinguish between different sections without relying solely on color. Don't pit color against color in bar graphs and pie graphs, for example, without a white divider line. This brings us to the end of my presentation. I hope that you learned what it takes to make your data visualizations accessible.
Hello, my name is Sam Leif, and I, along with my colleagues Ari Goffman and Hannah Gunderman, are here to talk about non-binary gender in taxonomy, data collection, and through the life cycle. Do I have to be an other to be myself? Being non-binary is its own beautiful experience with its own feelings. Other doesn't capture it. It erases us. This presentation is from 3 non-binary researchers, providing an overview of where non-binary genders matter in research and the research data lifecycle. Today, we're going to ask the question, how much gender do you need? While the instinct to be more inclusive often tends to provide more gender options, often an effective approach is to consider whether the issue needs gender at all. In this email exchange, the survey author decided that gender was not necessary for the purposes of the project. Sometimes it is necessary and useful for identifying disparities, but there are also situations, like an internal survey asking when and where staff members park their cars, where gender is unnecessary and can be removed. If the theory guiding your research doesn't lend itself to examination split by gender, don't collect unnecessary information. On the action side, often institutions won't change unless someone complains. Can you be that someone? So you've decided you need some gender. What's next? If your project includes theoretical reasons gender is worth analyzing, you need to explicitly include non-binary gender identities. Unfortunately, well-intentioned but poorly researched efforts have many ways to go wrong, some of which are on this slide. Gender is not a binary. While some people, both cis and trans, experience gender as either female or male, other people experience gender that is between those two, a combination, or entirely separate. The image here shows identities that fall under the non-binary umbrella. Many, but not all, non-binary people prefer that gendered pronouns used to discuss them reflect their gender correctly, often by using they/them pronouns or neopronouns like ze or here. Many surveys still include a default of a binary male or female, which will have one of 2 results. Either non-binary people will be mislabeled, or they will self-select out of responding, as all 3 of us do, which will skew your results. Another common choice is male, female, other, which, while well-meaning, sets non-binary identities as the literal other, not allowing us to use a specific label and being defined only in relation to implicit normal gender. A question to ask yourself when developing a survey is how much you need to know about a person's gender identity or their full gender history. Options like the one above, which is suggested in a guide for human-computer interaction researchers, binary trans men and trans women are not differentiated from cis men and women. This is generally in the vein of less gender. Some people may not want to disclose their gender for a wide range of reasons, while others may want to disclose their specific identity. After collecting the data, you have to prep it. In the data cleaning process, be sure that you are retaining whatever categories of gender you originally collected the data with. If you find yourself wanting to strip out other responses, ask yourself why. Is it because of sample size? Are you excluding non-binary and trans individuals for an explicit purpose? If not, removing this data erases these participants' experiences from your data and should be disclosed. Alternatively, if you find yourself wanting to collapse responses outside of male-female into an other catch-all category, ask yourself why. These categories simply can't be collapsed and retain fidelity to the research process. Also, for any open answered questions, be sure you take into account the different ways people write out their gender, such as gender-queer versus genderqueer. If collating these, be sure not to conflate different genders together, such as gender nonconforming and genderqueer, but also make sure to provide enough buckets that people of shared identities are analyzed together. It's a balancing act. Also consider confidentiality if there are few respondents. Would selecting a gender potentially lead to difficulties with maintaining anonymization? If you're working with a data repository and it allows for faceted searches across data sets, does this faceting allow for searching by gender? If so, are the gender options inclusive? If this is not the case, you can start a conversation with the vendor or the local team managing the repository to understand what would need to happen for a more inclusive faceted search. In summary, ask yourself, do you actually need gender? Make sure to include non-binary gender as a gender option that isn't other. Finally, reach out to survey and metadata creators to include non-binary values, even and especially if you're cis. Language changes over time. If you are working on research and collecting gender, you should commit to constantly learning and understanding current language around gender. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Michael Moore. I'm a librarian at the University of Washington Health Sciences Library, and what today is surprisingly sunny, Seattle, Washington. We'll be talking a little bit about supporting RDAP at UW in the time of COVID. Just a little bit of background on RDAP for those who may be unfamiliar with it. It's a browser-based data collection and database management platform that was developed by Vanderbilt in the early 2000s. It's mostly found in non-commercial academic research settings. The thing that makes RDAP appealing to health sciences in particular is that it supports HIPAA compliance and other standards, so it's ideal for things like clinical trials and translational studies. RDAP was first launched at UW in 2012 by the Institute of Translational Health Sciences, or ITHS. We use what is referred to as a predominantly self-serve model, meaning that RDAP admins can review changes, approve projects, answer general questions, and so on. But we aren't going to build your project for you unless it's as part of a paid consult. In the early years of RDAP at UW, there was just one solo admin, but with steady user growth, that was really becoming untenable. So fast forward to late 2016, HSL and ITHS partnered with other organizations to launch the TRAIL initiative to support translational research at UW. As part of TRAIL, HSL librarians and staff joined the RDAP support team as admins, and we moved to a two-tiered ticketing system. The library team, usually comprised of 4 to 5 librarians or other staff, each covering one day of the week, were responsible for level 1 tickets. More complex questions were answered by ITHS's full-time RDAP admin at level 2. The use of RDAP has grown steadily, and so have the number of tickets RDAP agents have been answering. We went from about 7,900 in the first year of TRAIL in 2017 to 8,600 in 2018 and top 10,000 in 2019. Then in 2020, the number just skyrocketed by about 65% up to over 16,000. The reason, like with so many other things in 2020, was COVID-19. You may remember that Seattle area and King County, Washington was among the first parts of the country to be hit by COVID. UW's RDAP instance has been playing an important role in helping public health organizations at UW and local and county government levels in the response to COVID. This has been in the forms of projects that were case tracking in the early days to contact tracing to back to campus testing and so on. Overall, we have more than 650 COVID-related projects, including a number of national research projects with collaborators from around the country. Here you can see a breakdown of tickets closed per month and that massive spike in March and April. That's when many of the COVID projects were coming online and constantly evolving hour by hour, day by day. Major changes in the project design and scope were being finalized in the evening, It had to be implemented by the following morning so they can go into the workflow. As time went on, most of these projects settled into a design that worked for them. And although tickets are still far higher than they were in years past, they weren't at the same breakneck speed as that first wave. How did this impact us as agents? Well, we unofficially expanded our ticket support hours beyond 9 to 5, especially in those early months, because we knew that crucial changes were coming in constantly. Paid consults, which I mentioned before, were also prioritized for COVID-related projects, and those that weren't COVID-related were backburnered. But the biggest change was in staffing. We effectively doubled the number of agents supporting REDCap. Like many libraries, HSL has been closed since the pandemic started, and departments like user experience, whose jobs have largely been focused on in-person use, were forced to shift priorities, and the entire department graciously agreed to train up to serve as ticketing agents for REDCap. In late 2020, we were also fortunate to be able to hire a full-time junior REDCap admin to handle more of the load. Beyond that, they also say that necessity is the mother of invention, and shifting to an entirely online mode has brought up some other positive REDCap initiatives. Last October, the UW Human Subjects Division approved the REDCap e-consent framework, so we can obtain and store legally valid electronic consent signatures. This has been a big boon to over 350 projects on our REDCap servers, and they've collected more than 150,000 consent forms since October. REDCap classes that had been hosted weekly in HSL migrated online to Zoom. We had almost 1,000 total attendees in 2020, representing 17 countries. In closing, I'd just like to recognize all those who have served with me as ticketing agents over the last year. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Ben Jupasa, the Economics and Data Librarian at the University of Notre Dame's the very Center for Digital Scholarship in the Hesburgh Libraries. And today I'd like to share with you all my experiences with teaching carpentries online. So this is a common feeling felt by those who have never coded before, or those who are exposed to something like R or Python for the first time. The Carpentries programs leverages strategic teaching practices that help novices overcome this "I have no idea what I'm doing" dread and become competent practitioners, those who are empowered to experiment with the newly equipped skill set and apply what they've learned to their research projects. Typically, Carpentries workshops are taught in person. The general consensus was that teaching and learning coding is most effective in the physical classroom setting. But we all know what happened, and during the onslaught of COVID-19, no longer was the physical classroom open for business. So what does pivoting carpentries look like online? Can it be done? And most importantly, can it be done well? Before I talk about my experiences and observations, I wanted to share with you all the context that I'm working under. So since putting together this talk, I've taught 2 full-day online carpentries workshops. Both were on the R programming language, and Zoom was the chosen platform. As online became required and not necessarily just optional, the carpentries community was tasked with thinking through how to overcome barriers for learning. For example, the issue of information overload on a computer screen. How can learners manage lots and lots of information on a single screen during a workshop? When you learn R synchronously, for example, learners have to juggle an R Studio interface with a Zoom meeting video, with Zoom group chat, and more. So here are some of my instructor team's post-workshop observations, as well as the feedback that was provided by the learners. From the instructor point of view, we found that juggling breakout rooms got really complicated and got time consuming. So there needed to be more intentionality behind when and why we would instantiate a breakout session. We may just need to do less in general. Instructors still need to reset, expectations on building strong rapport with their learners, and doing formative assessment in general can be difficult. Now, from the learner's point of view, it was really interesting to note that some of their commentary and feedback conflicts with assumed barriers that the instructors thought up of. Not to say that barriers don't exist at all, of course. For one thing, learners still appreciated the troubleshooting service and help that came along with carpentries. In an online context, this was done in breakout rooms. The fact that there are multiple instructors on hand is a positive thing, and this isn't a unique thing to online carpentries by any means. It is best practice in carpentries in general. And some learners felt like they were able to follow along, although some felt like they were playing catch-up. So there seems to be two stories going on. On a maybe more selfish point of view, I, as an instructor, admittedly felt more drained than satisfied in my overall experience. But from the learner's point of view, the online modality can arguably be seen as something more accessible. But it's also worthwhile to note the context you're working under. Because, for example, in the communities that you're all situated in, how could the digital divide actually disparage prospective learners? So here's a sampling of recommendations for those teaching carpentries workshops online based upon my team's trials and tribulations. Take more breaks than usual. Zoom fatigue is real. Carpentry's curriculum is generally really jam-packed. And in an in-person workshop, it's rare that instructors actually finish out an entire session. And in an online session, you'll need to adjust your expectations even further. And really consider what is the minimum that a person would need to learn to really understand the general concepts. One of my favorite graphs produced by the carpentries community is the one shown here on this slide, which basically says prioritize teaching skills that are both useful and don't take up a lot of time to master. So in short, teaching online is very much possible and doable. It just realistically takes a lot more planning, more thought, and a greater willingness to pivot tools and approaches. So where do we go from here? Well, the community is still learning. And thankfully, since the beginning of the pandemic, the carpentries community has developed and curated a ton of useful resources. Now, I'd like to take a moment to thank my Montana and Notre Dame colleagues who went through this journey with me. Those that teach carpentries knows that putting together and running these workshops can take a village. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Jen Doty, and I'm the Research Data Librarian at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. This is my lightning talk for the RDAP 2021 Virtual Summit. What's next? Sustaining data science support with a community of practice. I will share our experience of forming a cross-library community of practice focused on data science. Our primary objective was to keep pace with shifting priorities and opportunities to support data science initiatives at our institution, while remaining grounded in our library's mission to provide distinctive and diverse user-centered services. Like many academic libraries at research-intensive institutions, Emory has offered data services to our faculty, students, and staff in some form for years, whether through consultations, instruction and presentations to undergraduate and graduate level courses, or data curation type services. Which means that depending on one's point of view, data services at Emory occupies different roles and performs different work across our decentralized campus. Through a decade of interdepartmental working groups, conducting evaluations, assessments, and environmental scans, and under the auspices of a task force implementing a model of research data management services, we eventually launched a high-level university website in 2017, focused on research data, providing institution-specific guidance, and highlighting and connecting researchers with available resources. As we promoted the research data website and spoke with key stakeholders, the importance of placing names to services came up repeatedly. This led to the addition of a clear way to identify and contact data specialists. Working with our university's communications team and with the example of a similar service and user-oriented guide from our colleagues at the Georgia State University Library, we developed a flyer to highlight our services. As the design of this flyer illustrates, One challenge our research data management service model continuously confronts is the organizational separation of key roles. Reducing barriers to locating help motivated its creation, but to effectively refer users, we also needed a way to regularly communicate amongst and across our units. In further discussions at both the practicing librarian and library leadership levels, chartering a community of practice felt most appropriate for this context. Our communities of practice are defined locally as a group that comprises experts in a specified area or individuals seeking to share or learn about a particular service or topic. It meets less regularly than more formal groups and may share information in informal ways, which accomplishes our primary objective while lessening the administrative burden of a more formal committee structure. To share just a bit more specifics, we also have a clearly defined scope of what falls within and outside our purview, namely to focus on user-facing services, but not internal-facing library assessment or the creation of new services and policies. And finally, we have an inclusive representation of members within the libraries, our Digital Scholarship Center, and research computing experts in our Office of Information Technology. Since our group kicked off in November 2019, the pandemic has thrown a wrench in our community efforts, though we continue with virtual remote work and meetings, and we feel relatively well positioned to accelerate our efforts again as data science has only increased in prominence and urgency, particularly for a university with very active health sciences research and the CDC as a literal neighbor to our Atlanta campus. Thanks for the opportunity to share our experience with the RDAP community, and please feel free to reach out with any questions.
Hi, my name is Reed Babe, and I'm the Research Data Management Librarian at the University of Houston Libraries. Today, I'm here to share information with you about an update to an important community resource for federal funding agency research data sharing policies that we did as part of a distributed group of research data management professionals working under the auspices of RDAP. The Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, or SPARC, is a global coalition that is committed to advancing open access, open data, and open education. Of top priority to the coalition is to facilitate understanding and implementation of policies and practices, and one of the prime ways they do this is through projects and website resources. The updated project is the Federal Data Sharing Policy Resource. This is a community tool that allows for tracking, comparing, and understanding current U.S. federal funder research data sharing policies. It was originally created in 2016 in a collaboration between SPARC and Johns Hopkins University Libraries, in particular, Jonathan Petters, who put out the call and led the team into this update starting in late January of 2020. Many of you may have already used this resource in your activities. It is an incredibly useful tool for supporting data management professionals in navigating federal funder data sharing policies and guidance. The tool allows you to search for an agency and to access information relating to 13 different facets of data sharing policy, including data management plans, metadata, preservation, and many others. Links to the specific agency materials are provided within the web content, and the interface allows you to view and compare up to 3 different agencies at the same time. As you can imagine, it is important to SPARC and to the community that we keep this resource current, and there have been quite a lot of changes, including the release of new or updated policies and plans and guidance that have happened in the 5 years since the initiation of the project. And this is in a continued response to the 2013 OSTP memo that was released 8 years ago now. We used the same facets as defined by the initial analysis that aligned with the elements of the OSTP and sought out the new documents, new policies, and new information that related to these established criteria. Our group consisted of a 5-person team from across the country. Each of us are connected with RDAP and are working in data management and data sharing roles at diverse institutions. Each member of our team had their own specific interests in diving into the federal agency policies and plans, but above all, we shared a desire to see this information resource sustained. This interest arose both in its utility as a trusted tool for our own use as data management professionals and at a broader level where these mandates, recommendations, and guidance become that much more accessible to a wide audience of practitioners, researchers, and other stakeholders. At the same time, the process allowed us to learn more about the nuances of the agencies and a lot more about each other and the work that we do. This update was a valuable endeavor for growth on so many levels. Our team also wants to acknowledge the hard work and support from Nick Shockey and Lisi Fendel at Spark, who made this possible, and a huge thank you to Spark for their sponsorship of the summit this year. We started the work almost a year ago, January 2020, and worked till February 2021. Originally, we had planned for it to happen over the course of a couple of months, but it proved to be more complex than we ever imagined with the onset of the pandemic and the challenges that followed. We are all really proud of the work, and it's really great to see it finalized on the website and to have all the data and related files posted on the Open Science Framework. Hannah did an amazing job organizing and building this project as an archive for the files. This is linked to the website for access. After this year, we are left with an amazing data set and some new perspectives on the changes that occurred over the last 5 years. As a result, we're in the process of a comprehensive analysis of this content, and we're working to get an article out that looks at the outcomes and trends that we've seen in relationship to our communities and the work that we do. We are also looking forward to future collaborations with Spark, and we are very honored to have this relationship and continued discussions with them. Finally, you can read more about the project on our 2 blog posts, and I welcome you to check out the updated content and the OSF project materials as well. I want to send a thank you to the team, to Spark, and to RDAP for the opportunity to collaborate on this work.
Hi everyone, my name is Era Tansey, and I am an archivist who works at the University of Cincinnati. My area of research is archives and climate change, and before I get any further, I want to define what I mean by archives. Archives are any institution that cares for archival records, and archivists also call these places repositories. Archival records include things like birth and death certificates, land surveys, papers of politicians or authors, or the records of institutions themselves. Because archival records are usually original documents that don't exist anywhere else, archives are particularly vulnerable if they are hit by some kind of disaster, which is an increasing risk with climate change. There are 2 major sources of climate change threats to archives, short-term and long-term. And short-term disasters include things like fires, hurricanes, and floods. But longer-term risks include sea level rise and inland migration caused by coastal abandonment. When I began working on the intersection of archives and climate change, one of the major issues I kept running up against was being able to contextualize the risk to archives. If you ask, where's every archive in the United States and how many are vulnerable to climate change? No one has a good answer. And that's because the archives profession has not historically maintained an authoritative and comprehensive data set of US archives. Now, when I began my work on archives and climate change, there was one data set from the library organization OCLC. OCLC's archive grid data set has about 1,200 institutions, but it primarily overrepresents large research libraries. And that means that a lot of small historical societies were flying under the radar. My collaborators and I were able to use that limited data set to make some important findings on how climate change might impact archives. But we knew that better data about where repositories are located was a critical need for our profession. Now, to create a better data set, my collaborator, Ben Goldman, who is at Penn State University, and I received funding from the Society of American Archivists for a project that we call Repo Data. We contacted a total of 151 archival associations. And in the United States, there are archival associations at varying geographic and topical areas and levels. So you might belong to the Greater New Orleans Archivists, or the Midwest Archives Conference, or the Association of Moving Image Archivists. And our question was to ask, what existing data each association had on the institutions within their membership area, and to share that data with our project team. And in the end, we received enough data to geolocate about 18,000 repositories in the United States. So let's take a look at some before and after images so you get a sense of the impact of our project. So this map with the green dots represents the original limited data set of 1,200 archives. But following our data gathering project, we identified far more institutions that care for archival records. And you can look at the data on a state level to see how dramatic this difference is. The map on the left with the original limited data set shows archives mostly centered around Ohio's 3 major metropolitan areas of Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland. But the map on the right is after the Repo Data project and demonstrates how the effort identified many more smaller institutions outside of the major metropolitan areas. Now, once we had this data, I began to create some tools using ArcGIS Online. And in the following maps that you're going to see, each dot represents an archive. So in the first map, users can enable the National Hurricane Center's hurricane path projections to identify archives that might be in the pathway of a coming hurricane. And this is important, especially for emergency management professionals who might need to identify which archives might need to evacuate some of their holdings in the period before hurricane landfall. Now, in the second map, users can review current precipitation and stream gauge data using an Esri data layer that incorporates geological survey and NOAA data. And this is particularly important for inland archives, which might be located in floodplains. We often think of the major risks of flooding being along coastal areas, but we know that things that are far inland also have major flooding risks as well, depending on their elevation and where their location is in a floodplain. And then finally, this is a map that depicts longer-term threats to archives, which is sea level rise. So this animation shows a progression of up to 6 feet of future sea level rise based on NOAA projections. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, what are archivists doing about all of this? Well, there are many state and local disaster response networks for cultural heritage institutions, and many of them do recognize the role that climate change is playing in creating more frequent and more severe disasters for these institutions. Gathering and improving data about where archives are located is a critical step in raising awareness about the threats to our cultural heritage.
Good afternoon. I am Jonathan Bohan, Data Archive Specialist for the Cornell Institute for Social and Economic Research, part of the Cornell Center for Social Sciences. I'm here to talk about preparing for changing research data and materials retention policies. Archival requirements for researchers are changing rapidly, both among publishers and institutions. For example, science journals state that all computer code central to the findings being reported should be available to readers to ensure reproducibility. The American Geophysical Union encourages authors to identify and archive their data in approved data centers while defining data to include new code and computer software used to generate results or analyses reported in the paper. The American Journal of Political Science states that authors must provide materials that are sufficient to enable interested researchers to verify all of the analytic results that are reported in the text and supporting materials. There are numerous other examples. On the university level, data policies are beginning to fall into line with the journal requirements. At Cornell, an interim research data retention policy was instituted last year, which states that reproducibility, which is the ability to verify research findings by other members of the scientific community or by using other methods, is essential to the advancement of science. This ability requires access to relevant research data, materials, documents, protocols, methods, and procedures. The University of Pittsburgh, in their policy, state that in practice, scientific data include both intangible data and tangible data, and records should include sufficient detail to permit examination for the purpose of replicating the research. And finally, University of Mississippi's Medical Center states that research data include, but are not limited to, laboratory notebooks, as well as any other records that are necessary for the reconstruction and evaluation of reported results of research and the events and processes leading to those results, regardless of the form or the media on which they are recorded. So what does this mean for data librarians and archivists? Most data archives have not been designed with code archiving in mind. This has the possibility of dozens to hundreds of files, which need to be run in a precise order using specific software. In addition, code is not data. It requires extensive documentation explaining processes, but it also needs the data itself to be useful. Storing code with data can be wasteful of valuable storage space when data can be used for multiple publications. One has to decide whether it makes sense to store the data together with the code, or should each have separate but linked catalog records. And finally, materials are tied to a specific publication and can be viewed as an extension of that publication. So it requires a special citation of that publication, separate from any later citations of archival materials. At CISR, we've instituted a results reproduction service for Cornell researchers. Our consultants work with the researchers to ensure that their code and data actually produce the results that are in their publication. We say to think of it as enhanced proofreading for your data and code. As part of this service, we archive the entire package, which is put into a zip archive with detailed instructions for running the code, including information on the exact version of the software used to run the code. This allows researchers to reproduce the published results. The archival record for this R² package is stored within a separate database from our data archive, but is findable through the same search functionality. We provide a suggested citation, a persistent identifier, links to the researcher's ORCID and/or ResearchGate profiles, and a special citation for what we call the reference article. We can choose to archive the data within the zip archive or in a separate record within the data archive if we believe the data may be used for multiple publications. Thank you for your time, and I would be happy to answer any questions I can or take comments or feedback through email.
All right, that was our last lightning talk for this session. I want to thank all of the lightning talk presenters for the engaging talks that they submitted. I am going to jump into the chat and see if we've got any questions. We have about 7 minutes or so to answer any questions. Chat up. All right. I don't see any questions. Reed or Amelia, do you? There's no open questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Oh, whoop, one just popped in. Okay, so question for Ira, and if I said that wrong, apologies. The question is, cool work and story map. Have you considered looking at climate impacts on archives associated with loss of power, for example, related to cold snaps and heat waves? Perhaps the danger to collections is far less as compared to floods.
That's a great question. You know, I had thought about something related to this back a few years. I don't remember when this was, but I think it was before the pandemic. There was wildfires in California that knocked all of the O'Reilly databases offline. And I think the problem with, you know, this is a little bit outside of my level of knowledge, but I think there are some things with climate change where it's kind of easy to sort of get that data and model it out, and there are other things that aren't, right? And so I think if you were looking at temperature, I think the original question was about temperature changes, right? Yeah, so you would want to make sure that you're working with a good set of data first, so that you know what you're measuring, so that you don't come up with something. So it's something I've thought about, but have not made clear progress on right now. Yeah.
All right. Next question is, whoop, they keep popping in, so the chat keeps going up and it's hard to read. Okay, so for Jonathan, to what lengths do you go to try to reproduce the results? What's the cutoff to say I can't reproduce it?
Hi, so there's no real cutoff. It's all based on what the researcher wants. So our consultants work with them. They will run the code. If it doesn't match up with the results that they're showing, they'll work to fix the code. They'll keep running it until it works, or until the researcher says, never mind, I'm not, I give up, I'm not going to do it. So there is no real cutoff at this point.
Thank you. All right, next question. It's anonymous. And they also don't say who it's for, but I'm gonna read it anyway. Has there been much uptake on the result reproducibility service? Okay, so.
I think that's for me.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I just, as soon as I read it, I was like, oh, that's for you too.
Yeah, it's been going for a few years now. It was a bit slow at first, but as more of our researchers get to know it, we're seeing more and more. I think there's, at the moment, 3 or 4 projects in the pipeline, so it's going pretty good.
Thank you. All right, next question for Reed and Jonathan. What is the link to the Spark data sharing resource? If you want, you can pop that into the chat. And I'll move on to the next question, which I believe, okay, is from Laura. Question for presenter on web accessibility and digital inclusion. What is the best way to make contrast between lines in a chart? Is there software that does this by default?
Okay, I think that question's for me.
Yes, it is, Nancy. I'm sorry.
That's all right. This is Nancy here. There is a contrasting software for color contrast called WebAIMS, which is on the reference section of my slide deck, which gives you the best color contrast for foreground and background colors. But for adjacent colors, it's really good to look at colors that are colorblind friendly too. So try not to pair up red and green colors adjacent to each other in order to make it easier for people who are colorblind.
Thank you. And I think the last question is for Ben. Did you have any participants who took your classes over again, especially to practice?
So no, I have not come across that sort of instance, but we've had participants take advantage of some of the data help related services that the Center for Digital Scholarship provides in both in the Montana context when I was there, and also I've noticed or heard about it rather through the grapevine at Notre Dame as well. So yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And that's actually perfect timing because we are out of questions. From what I can tell, there's nothing else in the Q&A. And now we're gonna move into a break. So I want to thank all of the panelists again for the engaging lightning talks, and we will join back after a short 10-minute break.
Great. Thank you, Melissa, and all the lightning presenters. So we'll see you back here at, I guess it's 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, and we'll see you soon, 10 minutes.
Figshare is an easy-to-use research data repository system that allows academics to make all of their research outputs available in a citable, shareable, and discoverable manner. It also allows research data managers to manage the curation of files, keep account of their institution's research outputs, and measure the impact of those outputs. You can quickly and easily upload any file on Figshare, from PDFs, papers, and datasets to code, 3D printable files, and video. You control the ownership, the storage, the DOIs, the licenses, and the metadata. And we take care of the rest. Figshare is an easy-to-use research data repository system that allows academics to make all of their research outputs available in a citable, shareable, and discoverable manner. It also allows research data managers to manage the curation of files, keep account of their institution's research outputs, and measure the impact of those outputs. You can quickly and easily upload any file on Figshare, from PDFs, papers, and datasets to code, 3D printable files, and video. You control the ownership, the storage, the DOIs, the licenses, and the metadata. And we take care of the rest.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We are now going to start our second panel session for the day. And during the end of the first day of the summit, it's going by quickly. For the panel, Kim McKenzie will be our moderator, and I'll go ahead and pass it on to you.
Thanks, Reed. Everybody, thank you for attending panel 2. The title for this panel is Data Management Plans and Fair Practices. As probably all know by now, this is a Zoom webinar. Attendees are muted and your cameras are turned off. To ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and please include the name of the presenter for who your question is for. The session is going to run from 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific time, so 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. And the last 15 minutes will be for a Q&A with all presenters. So all questions will be held until the end of the panel. We also have a Discord server set up for the more informal conversations running throughout the summit. And so please feel free to continue the discussion or conversation over on that platform. We have a code of conduct set up. The Research Data Access and Preservation Summit organizers are committed to providing an environment where all attendees can participate fully in the program and activities without fear of harassment or discriminatory behavior of any kind. There are code of conduct helpers available during the session, Amy Arnell or Laura Legedon, who you may contact if you need assistance. Okay, so just a reminder for the presenters, we talked about timing, so if you want to set timers for yourself, I will also hold up signs in the video to let you know when, there you go, to let you know when you're getting close to the end. So first, we're going to hear from Maya Doliner from the Slovenian Social Science Data Archives at the University of Ljubljana. Maya, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for giving me the word. I'm just going to share my screen. Is it okay?
Yes.
Do you see my slides?
Yeah. Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk today at this panel. I'm going to talk about the trustworthiness of digital repositories and in connection with enabling these fair data principles. So what do I mean actually with trustworthiness? We can say that trust is basically at the heart of storing and sharing data. We have various stakeholders that are involved in the process. And on the one hand side, we have data funders who want, of course, reassurances that their investments in the production of research data is not wasted, but that this research data will remain also into the future. Then we have data depositors who wants to be sure that their data are in a safe place and that they remain accessible, usable, and meaningful also over time. And at the end of the chain, we have data users who want to know what data have been that the data have been preserved properly and are of high quality, the data that they reuse. So what do I mean with the data repositories? Repositories are basically are there to preserve, manage, and provide access to digital materials, of course, in a variety of formats, and these materials are curated. So putting in a more simple words, repositories basically take the responsibility for data management, and they ensure that they are held in an appropriate environment for appropriate periods of time. We can talk about different types of repositories. On the one hand side, we have domain repositories, which are basically subject-based repositories that specialize in a specific research field or data type, and usually also have a really well-defined group of users. Often we can talk about here some sort of a national or regional remit, and they can also be part of a wider network or subject to international agreements regarding data sharing and management. On the other side, we have generalist repositories, which are more generic and basically multi-subject repositories. Typical examples would be, for example, a university library or some open access repositories such as Zenodo, for example. Here, the user community is likely to be very broad, and it may even be basically general public at large. So how do we establish trustworthiness of data repositories? This question has been answered through the creation of several certification services. The most lightweight and the most popular of them all is the so-called Core Trust Seal that was developed by a partnership working group under the Research Data Alliance between the Data Seal of Approval and the World Data System of the International Science Council. The certification standard basically plays a really important role in establishing trust and hence sustaining the opportunities for long-term data sharing. These standards look at technical infrastructure as well as organizational, financial, staffing, some legal aspects, in addition to all the workflows within the repository, their risk management, their security, how their security issues are taken care of, and so on. Standards expect that system will operate according to their objectives and specifications, and that the data sets they distribute are complete, and they exclude unintended modifications. And of course, that they actually contain what they claim to contain. And data and services, of course, are expected to be accessible and usable. So, as I already said, a number of synergetic and complementary certification procedures now coexist and can be used by data repositories to get this certification. The core certification is the Core Trust Seal, which came from the community-based norms that were granted to data repositories who obtained the DSA or WDS membership. And this core certification consists of 16 requirements. These are the 16 requirements. I will not go into detail into each and every one of them. You can, if you are interested, check them out yourself by just typing in Core Trust Seal. What is interesting to point here is that they are basically structured into 3 sections. The first one containing the questions regarding the organizational infrastructure of the repository. So these are all the questions about how the organization is structured. And the second section is about the actual digital object management, where all the workflows and procedures come into place. And the last section is about technology and security that the data repository has. So the extended certification, which is the next level of the certification framework, is basically granted to repositories who perform a structured, externally reviewed and publicly available self-audit. This is based on DIN 31644, or so-called Nestor seal. And this is consists of 34 criteria. And this is more extensive, of course, than the core trust seal or the core certification. The highest level of certification within this framework is the so-called formal certification, and this is a highly demanding standard that involves a full external audit and certification, and is based on ISO 16363. And this has over 100 metrics that a repository needs to kind of fulfill. Looking at the FAIR data principles, these principles are focused on scientific data management and stewardship, and they were formed for the first time during the 2014 workshop entitled Designing a Data Fairport for the Life Sciences in Leiden in Netherlands. And here this minimal set of community agreed guiding principles were formulated. And after their initial definition at this workshop, they were substantively expanded in the 2016 article that was published in Scientific Data Journal, and they were extensively also operationalized and defined. And the result of this article were defined 14 metrics that you see here on this slide, and that really help with the implementation of those FAIR principles. The first principle is about the findability of data. This is, of course, also the first step in actual using the data, because you need to find data first. So here you need metadata and data that are easy to find, not only for users, but also for the machines. And this machine readability of the FAIR data principles come, in my opinion, from the context in which they were designed. So this is coming from life sciences that were already quite advanced in that way during the formation of these principles. The second principle is the principle of accessibility. So once the user finds data, he or she also needs to know how he or she can access data, and possibly also elements like authentication and authorization play a role here. And then taking it one step further, we have interoperability of data, because very often data need to be integrated with other data sets in order for a researcher to conduct a research. So in addition, the data needs to interoperate with various applications or workflows for analysis of data, storage of data, or processing of data. And finally, we have reusability of data, and that is really the ultimate goal of FAIR. So optimizing reuse of data sets. And to achieve that, metadata and data should be very well described, so they can be replicated and or combined with other data sets or in different settings also. So if you look at this whole conglomerate of principles and metrics, I think you can very well say that being fair really means that you take care of high quality and responsible management of data that you generate. Another element of the FAIR principles is that I think that there is still a lot of confusion about them concerning what they actually mean. I think that first of all, when we are speaking about FAIR principle, we are speaking in the wrong direction. When we are defining data sets as being fair or not fair. I would like to see it really more like a continuum, and every researcher should try to make their data as fair as possible. So it is a kind of an ideal situation that we should all strive for. But in some situations, of course, it is impossible to reach this ultimate 100% fairness. There also seems to be a lot of confusion about distinction between open data on the one hand and fair data on the other hand. But because there really is a difference between the both terms. You can have, for example, a data set that is really 100% openly available, but that does not mean that it is necessarily also fair. It can be open, but for example, if you do not have a good description of data in terms of metadata, if it does not have, for example, a persistent identifier and so on, then it is not fair at all. And this also works, of course, the other way around. You can have a fair data set, but if it contains very sensitive information, for example, personal information about people, it can never be openly available. So open and fair is definitely not the same. There are some characteristics of the FAIR data principles. Firstly, the focus of the FAIR principles is on data and the associated data, and the metrics really speak to this. A second observation is that we really see around FAIR principles the evolution in time from principles to metrics to implementations, because first we had these four the FAIR data principles. They were very generic, very abstract, and very high level. Then we got to the operationalization of them and the development of these metrics. And today we are in a phase when we see all kinds of implementations popping up in form of international projects, international initiatives and groups. We see that people are producing tools and guidances for researchers to produce FAIR data. We see that funders are producing instruments and tools, and publishers as well, that enable them to assess the fairness of existing data. We see tools popping up that would help you with what they call the faiриfication of existing data, making existing data even more fair. And finally, I think we are on the way to create the whole FAIR ecosystem of FAIR tools and data and services. All of that meant to improve the technical quality of data in order to make them more reusable, and that in turn contributes to open science in general. A final observation would be that fairness of a data set or digital object really gives you a snapshot in time. So it is basically looking at a data set really in isolation of its context. Here you see a picture that maps the 16 requirements of the core certification, so the core trust seal, with the 14 metrics of FAIR. And there you can see there is quite a lot of overlap. A lot of requirements for repositories really directly or indirectly refer to the fairness of repository holdings. For example, with respect to metadata used, or with respect to the persistent identifiers or formats in which your data are gathered, etc. So we can see that a lot of requirements really refer to the fairness of the data that the repository holds. The trust landscape, including FAIR and open data, is developing rapidly today. And to date, the report Turning FAIR into Reality from 2018 that was produced by the European Expert Group remains the common reference in Europe and beyond, and is basically a baseline for many of the FAIR and European Open Science Cloud related work packages and projects that are developing this. So this report outlines basically an entire FAIR ecosystem that relies on policies, data management plans, identifiers, standards, and repositories. Repositories offer databases and data services and should be certified according to emerging standards for trustworthiness and FAIR. Repositories providing long-term stewardship of data should be encouraged and supported to achieve core trust seal certification, so at least to achieve this core level of certification. It is important also to emphasize that in addition to making digital objects fair, it is essential that they are actually kept fair over time. And this is a task that usually requires resources and is usually also domain-specific expertise. The preservation aspect is often underestimated or forgotten in the ongoing discussion. So the FAIR Working Group of the European Open Science Cloud Executive Board considered core trust seal as the right level of research data repositories and recommended that the core trust seal plus the FAIR approach that is proposed by the FAIR project, so like evaluating the data sets according to their fairness, should be extensively tested amongst the data repositories. To conclude, trustworthy repositories add value because they enable at least a baseline fairness level to a data set they hold, although some of the data set within a data repository can be more fair than others, which is of course connected to other characteristics of a data set. And they can of course contribute to maintain or even increase the level of fairness over time through appropriate data curation and stewardship services. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. And
thank you very much, Maya. It's very interesting.
Stop sharing.
Yes, we're all set.
Yes.
Next, we're going to hear from Dusty Kirilova from the Qualitative Data Repository.
Thank you. Hi. Let me just make sure I can share my slides okay, and then I'll start. Sorry, could you confirm that you see my screen okay?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Yes, so I am Dusty Kirilova from the Qualitative Data Repository, which is both core trust seal, well, we were certified, we're in the process of getting recertified, but compliant, and we serve up fair data, just to connect with the previous presenter. But what I'm going to talk about here today is kind of a very specific research project that we did on the interaction, or what we call the nexus, between data management plans and IRB protocols or processes that scholars go through. Just to give a little bit of background, I would explain also something about the Qualitative Data Repository. It is exactly as the name suggests, a niche specialized domain repository for data that are either exclusively qualitative, or the large part of them are qualitative and they come from a larger multi-method project, but that's really our core focus and expertise. And we serve the social sciences really broadly defined. We are hosted by Syracuse University, but we're not a Syracuse University entity. We serve social scientists across the world, really, not even just the US, but anybody from anywhere who might want to deposit qualitative data, and of course, anybody, the potential secondary users. And the reason why I'm explaining a little bit about what our repository does is because that would give you an idea of kind of the motivations and how we came upon this discussion of the DMP IRB nexus and the need for maybe more discussion, as I will try to illustrate. So the motivation for this was from very early on that, so QDR is a fairly new institution. We've been online and publicly available since 2015, but from the very early months of operations, we would receive would-be deposits by social scientists who wanted, for one reason or another, to share their data. And we would start, doing our regular kind of curation conversations with them before we even started processing the data. And one of the first things that we ask, as you can imagine, especially with qualitative data in the social sciences, many of which involve human participant data, we would ask for their IRB protocol and specifically their informed consent script. And in case after case, we would not, I don't want to say everybody, but in many cases, we would encounter the kind of language in the consent script that makes any data sharing and long-term preservation, any of that, completely impossible, because the scripts contain language like, I, the researcher, will be the only person who ever sees these data, or my team will be the only people that I will give access to. And in some rarer, but still in some cases, even the script will talk about these data, these materials that you're sharing with, or sorry, this information that you're sharing with me, the transcripts, for example, from our conversations will be destroyed after 5 years. And clearly we discovered that what should be a very obvious point of intersection between what the promises made in an informed consent process and the plans for data sharing, that should be an obvious intersection, is not so obvious always, certainly not to the researchers. And then we started thinking, okay, if the researchers are not clear on this, where could they possibly get more guidance? Where could they possibly get more clarity on this topic? Wouldn't their IRB have done something in that vein? And so we decided to then go on to well, and also, sorry, I'm going to skip through some of my slides because otherwise I will also run out of time. But obviously the IRBs are concerned with the same kinds of questions that at least part of data management planning should be addressing as well. You know, how much risk might the data carry, and how much additional risk might potential data sharing add, and then what are some steps and technologies and techniques to ameliorate those risks. You know, were the participants asked for their permission to share the data, which, as I said, is the first thing we as a repository look at when human participant data are involved. But those are the same kinds of questions that IRBs would be presumably asking when reviewing protocols. So it was very kind of strange to us not knowing what led to these scripts that conflicted with the researchers' desire otherwise to share their data. And once we started looking, you know, you could tell that there's, you know, among some people there's awareness, and obviously among others there isn't. So we came across this article, which is not so new anymore, but you know, at the time was reporting on a survey of NSF awardees about their concerns about data sharing, and all the narrative answers that were reported talked about IRB restrictions, you know, issues of confidentiality, anonymity, the kinds of things that, again, an IRB process should have surfaced or should have people thinking about. So oftentimes in this, the way actors in the data sharing landscape are kind of grouped, we have the funders and publishers who set out these requirements and mandates that then researchers are supposed to follow, who are seen as the so the funders and publishers are seen as the enforcers of data sharing policies and mandates. The places like repositories and data librarians at universities and other such dedicated research data services are seen as the enablers, the kind of people and factors that make this possible. Researchers obviously are the implementers. And then the IRBs, if they're given any thought at all in this interaction, are seen as the hurdles. So we decided, okay, let's see really what do IRBs themselves think about the topic of data sharing, especially again of human participant data. How do they see themselves in that equation? Are they aware of these things? Where are they finding the information from? So this is really kind of what we have a broader research project now, talk about some of the findings that most recently we've discovered. But the first instantiation of that was, we didn't even go to the IRBs yet. We just went to their website. So it was kind of a more passive data collection. We looked at the publicly available guidance documents of IRBs at 50 universities across the US, which we selected because they were the recipients of the highest amounts of funding from the National Science Foundation in the social, behavioral and educational sciences, because we thought that those are the kinds of places whose researchers would be most obviously under the mandate to certainly to provide a data management plan as part of their NSF proposals, but beyond that, potentially would be feeling, you know, the need to plan for data sharing in an appropriate way. And of course, everybody, all researchers who work with human participants would be under the mandates to certainly do ethical research, but also specifically go through the IRB processes of their universities. And what we discovered at the time was, at least looking at the public-facing guidance documents that IRBs at these places provided, they were giving very little to none thought or guidance on the topic of data sharing, as you can see very quickly here. Of the 114 documents that we reviewed, 3 talked about sharing, 4 talked about archives, and 5 talked about repository. And then any number of other terms that we tried to search for were not at all mentioned. So that was kind of in confirmation of the experience that maybe IRBs are not the source of information that we thought that maybe they should be for researchers who are trying to do their research ethically, but at the same time plan for data sharing. So the next level of what we decided to do, the next stage of the project, was more recently in 2019 to actually go and interview IRB personnel. And we started sort of with the same list because, as I told you, we think that these are the kinds of institutions where the dual mandate, so to speak, or the potentially conflicting pressures of doing research ethically and meeting very kind of formal IRB obligations on the one hand, but also being asked to participate in open science, share the data when appropriate, and however appropriate, are most at play for individual researchers. So it is not, obviously not a representative sample by any means, but we thought that those are the kinds of universities that would be where the pressures are most relevant, first of all, as I said, but also that they are often kind of trendsetters in the academic space. So whatever happens there might be informative for other types of institutions as well. And to some degree, the people that we ended up talking to, obviously they self-selected to respond to our inquiry and interest in talking to them. So clearly not a representative sample, but nonetheless, I think we found some interesting things in conversations with them. So we had 17 individuals from different institutions, and then another 12 institutions represented through focus groups that we held regionally, one in Chicago and one in the DC area. So what are some of the things that we found in terms of, again, to what degree are US-based IRBs aware of the kind of increased expectations for participating in open science, data sharing more specifically? What do they advise their people? Those are the kinds of questions that we were asking them. So just some quick findings. Where do IRBs first learn about data sharing was of interest to us? Like, are they, where do they first learn about data sharing? The most obvious answers that everybody gave, which we anticipated to some degree, so those are the expected answers, were that they learn about that topic from researcher protocols. So when researchers come to them and they describe, potential data sharing, that sometimes is the very first time that across a given IRB team that they ever heard about this. Then, of course, as with everything, some take it upon themselves to learn more and research more and contact maybe the researcher to ask more questions about this. And others just, leave it at face value and sort of accept the researcher's own understanding of things, which, as I gave, alluded to in my early anecdotes, that may not be the best approach, that maybe the researchers are not always the people who know most about their own research, obviously, but they may not know the most about the best approaches to data sharing or the best way to square the two imperatives that we're talking about, ethical research and research transparency. And then all of them really, virtually everybody we spoke with said that there's no coherent institutional guidance that they've received on data sharing, that was never a driver for them to learn more about this topic. Then some less expected answers, which actually I found more interesting, were that oftentimes IRBs discovered about the practices of data sharing among scholars from people who wanted to be secondary users of already shared data, that sometimes, depending on the specific data projects that people were trying to access and the specific repositories that they were trying to get data from, they were required to go for secondary IRB review. And so then they would present a different type of protocol to their IRBs. And that would be the first time that a given IRB would have maybe heard about data sharing. Then also they talked about a particular type of data sharing, which is not really what we think about from the repository end, but was nonetheless interesting. So PIs who work either as part of very large teams from the same institution, but even more so when they collaborate with PIs from other institutions, there is already in those types of projects data sharing happening. And oftentimes they involve the IRBs to kind of work out the processes more clearly and more formally from the beginning, even though this is not public data sharing necessarily. And those projects might not result in publicly shared data, but nonetheless, some sharing is happening. And so that is sometimes where the cases where IRBs would learn about data sharing. And then sometimes people told us that was less frequent, but that they would read about, kind of in the popular press, they would read about science scandals, and they would always be the implication, why weren't those data shared, or were those data shared so we can see what that person really did? And then the IRB personnel that we talked to would start thinking, well, what would we have done if it was, for example, at our university? Would the data have been shared, or where would our role would have been in all of this? And then all of them really talked about the fact that to the degree that there's any policy, again, there was never, they said that an internal institutional guidance documents were never the driver for them to learn about data sharing. But to the degree that any institution had come together to then develop policy on these topics, it was always the policy followed practice, which, you know, is one of the ways in which policies are created. They're not always a priori existing, that then people just have to implement. But the downside of that process of creating policies on data sharing was that they reflect the idiosyncrasies of particular studies that happen to be, you know, taking place on a given campus, and often led to ad hoc solutions that then had to be revised and so on. Nonetheless, everybody kind of thought that for the moment might be the best approach, might just kind of a pragmatic, like this is kind of what it is until we learn a lot more, until we see a lot more examples of these things, and then we can figure out how to phrase it in a more comprehensive policy. Nonetheless, even though everybody kind of seemed to acknowledge that may be just kind of the state of play for right now on these topics, they all wish that there was a centralized source of more uniform information, of more uniform kind of standardized forms that they could follow or implement in their forms that address data sharing. And then then what are the kind of their reactions to how to the IRB's work, how to modify it so that it addresses these needs for researchers better. The most common was change the forms, kind of, again, very formalistic. And typically they said that their forms had contained questions about data storage during the course of any project and potential disposition after the end. But more recently, and they gave the timeline unprompted, really, they said within the last 2 to 3 years that's been happening from the IRB's work, that they recently have added new questions. Will the data be shared in any form? Will the shared data be de-identified or not? And what will be the period of retention? Kind of prompting researchers who may not have even discussed in their IRB protocol any data sharing plans, prompting them to think about that earlier on. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing here. And then the least common, but I felt I should bring it up here just again in the interest of giving you an idea of what IRBs think about all of this. That there is a shift in mindset, at least among some people in these positions. Yes. That there are rare examples, but sometimes people would say things like, in submissions, researchers will say, this might lead to increased knowledge about X, and we take that on faith. But if that data never gets out there in the scientific community, and if it is never shared, that benefit can't be realized. So there are actually some people on IRBs that are starting to think about data sharing as a benefit and not only as a risk, which is kind of, again, typically how the IRBs are seen in discussions of data sharing, that they're the hurdles and kind of the ones that make it impossible, but that's not always the case. So the lessons for, again, the people that I'm imagining are listening to this is the need of more holistic data management and, oh my goodness, the need for intercampus coordination, that all of these bodies and all of these entities on any one campus kind of have to work together, and that they often, unfortunately, do not. So how I had a little subtitle here, again, imagining that maybe amongst you, there's a lot of data librarians. What I think any individual data librarian can do to help in this process is to either join, if it exists on their campus, or initiate a coordination group of some sort. And this is the research data stewards title is something that we heard from some of the IRBs, that they said that has been recently started on their campus to contribute different research data services perspectives, so that they can inform the IRB. Reach out personally if you're on a smaller campus in particular, where starting such a group might actually be a little bit of an overkill. Just reach out personally to colleagues at all of these places that are listed on the previous Venn diagram, especially to IRBs. For your researchers, for your PIs, draw up a list of the relevant resources, including IRBs, kind of explaining what all of their roles might be in helping these researchers meet the seemingly conflicting demands for data sharing and ethical research. And if consulting on a GMP, which is of course something that data librarians do a lot, ask to see their consent script. Again, the researchers might not think to put those two things together. So since you're one point of contact for them, prompt them to think about those two together by asking to see their consent script and making sure that it does not promise anything that then would make impossible what they're promising in their data management plan. Highlight this nexus between DMPs and IRBs in any broader kind of generic trainings that you're doing on DMP. And here, I'll stop here just so I'm not taking up the next person's time. But then on the individual project level, we have some other recommendations, including an informed consent script that we've developed in conjunction with these conversations with IRB personnel, so they kind of are on board with this. Informed consent addition to the script that then enables data sharing, enables people, researchers to discuss the data sharing prospect with their participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Desi. That's great. Okay, our final presenters for today will be Heather Ganshorn and Zara Premji from the University of Calgary.
Hi, I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. Okay, so can I just get a confirmation that you can see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Heather, and I'm presenting on behalf of both my colleague Zara and myself. She couldn't be here today. And I'm going to talk about how we developed a data management plan template for systematic reviews and related forms of knowledge synthesis at the University of Calgary. Well, actually for researchers in general, but just want to acknowledge a couple of individuals and organizations. So we would like to thank the Portage Network for its financial support for the development of this template. And we also want to thank our colleague, Dr. Paul Ronksley in the Department of Community Health Sciences, who offered guidance on some of the elements of the template that had more to do with aspects that librarians aren't usually involved in. So just by way of background, some of you might not be familiar with the Portage Network, and I know that Jeff Moon from Portage is going to be talking about research data management in Canada tomorrow, so I won't spend too much time on that. But it's basically a network founded in 2015 by the Canadian Association of Research Libraries to support the shared stewardship of research data in Canada, and works with a bunch of other stakeholder groups in the research sector to support the Canadian research community. And notably, Portage has a DMP assistant that is probably pretty analogous to the DMP tool in the US. It's used to create data management plans that align with the requirements of Canada's research funding agencies. And so they have been trying to create more customized templates, discipline-specific templates, and also example DMPs to help researchers develop their own plans. So we at the University of Calgary offer several librarian-led workshops on systematic reviews to the campus community, and both Zara and I also have been co-authors on several systematic reviews. For myself, largely in the health sciences. Zara has co-authored reviews in both the health sciences and business, which is kind of an area where this methodology is becoming popular as well. So in the course of our teaching and our practice, we've both worked on the development of tools and training, both for ourselves and for teaching others to make some aspects of the data management around systematic reviews easier and more transparent. And we've found that there tends to be quite a lack of guidance on this, and it's just kind of been you know, listservs and sort of DIY and customizing other things that we found. So when this call came out for developing DMP templates for Portage, we kind of jumped on it and thought we would love to do that because we would like to have one for ourselves. So that was last April that they sent out this call, and there was funding attached to it, and our proposal was successful. And we really wanted something that would support not only systematic reviews, which I kind of use as a catch-all phrase, but there's many other scoping reviews, mapping reviews, other types of knowledge synthesis, and our hope is that our tool will be useful for all of them. And we wanted that template really to address the questions that we had encountered in our own practice, and also, yeah, flexible enough to support some of the evolving knowledge synthesis methods in non-health sciences disciplines such as environmental science and business. And then our colleague Paul, who lent us a hand, is an epidemiologist who has co-authored many systematic reviews as well. So he was really helpful for those pieces of the data management that librarians tend not to be directly involved in. So the template, I was hoping I could show it to you today, and I can show you most of it, but it was slated to be published with the release of the Portage Network's DMP Assistant 2.0 earlier this month. And in the end, I think it got held up in translation because Canada has two official languages, English and French. It had to be translated into French, so it's going to be released any day now, but I have a draft version that I can show you in the meantime. So just backing up a little bit before we dive into the LibGuide and the template itself, for those not familiar, we thought we should explain what systematic reviews and knowledge syntheses are. So both this graphic and this definition are from the Cochrane collaboration, which is sort of the gold standard organization that really pioneered the systematic review methodology. So it is an attempt to identify, appraise, and synthesize all the empirical evidence that meets pre-specified eligibility criteria to answer a specific research question. So researchers should be using explicit and systematic methods to minimize bias, to find all the relevant literature on a topic, and to produce more reliable findings to inform decision making. And sometimes these reviews will also include what's known as a meta-analysis. So all the studies included in the review, the reviewers will, if the data is homogeneous enough, extract the data and analyze it as a very large data set. Sometimes that isn't possible. And other times, another review method that has evolved is the qualitative synthesis, which I'm definitely not an expert in, but it is more either a synthesis of qualitative studies or perhaps a more qualitative approach to literature synthesis. So the authors really identify an issue and determine a question. They write a protocol, they search for studies, and then they sift through them, extract the data, do a quality assessment, and combine the data. So there's quite a lot of data that comes out of a systematic review. And one thing that we wanted to emphasize in this process to the researchers themselves is that the literature search is your data gathering, because researchers don't tend to think of literature searching in this way. They think of it as something you do for background before you move on to the real data gathering. But, and even when they approach a systematic review, they may be thinking, okay, well, the data gathering is sort of this data extraction phase where I've got my included studies and I extract the data from them. But really the data gathering begins with that systematic search. So that is something that you need to document well and retain the data for and make it fair, like transparent and reproducible. Also, systematic reviews are always a team endeavor. You really can't do one properly without at least two authors and often more. In our experience, those authors may not even all reside at the same institution. So even just the data management of the articles becomes an important part of your overall project management. And again, we haven't found a lot of specific guidance on this. Because a lot of the people we're working with are undertaking a systematic review for the first time, and may also be new to research data management in general. If they're students, we realized that we needed to create not only a template, but really an accompanying guide that would go into greater depth and could be used to support our teaching. So what we ended up with, and I will share my slides on the OSF site, and I've got the links in here. The template will be a selectable template within Portage's DMP assistant. So I just want to move on over and give you a little sense of what that looks like. So you have to have an account in DMP Assistant to use it this way, but they will also all be published on Zenodo. Portage has a Zenodo website, so you can access it there. But this, I just wanted to give an idea of what the overall template looks like. So these are the overall big sections, and then the researcher can fill in answers to specific questions. And this is just the generic DMP template, because as I said, mine is not in here yet. But there's guidance over on the right that will be, in the case of ours, more customized to a systematic review. So you can see there's not a lot of room here, and that was another reason why we had lots to say, because we have been through this process as researchers. So we were getting the ugly right-hand scroll. So to avoid that, we really did end up taking a lot of that stuff out, putting it on a LibGuide, and making it complementary to the template itself. So I've got so far, because again, it isn't up on Zenodo yet, I've got just a general link to the Portage Network's Zenodo community, but it will be available very soon in both English and French. And in the meantime, I do have it in English. So it's just got a little bit of an abstract. The way that we sort of designed it, was really, I think I'm just going to move over to the LibGuide here. So these are meant to be used in conjunction with each other, and the template will link to the LibGuide. We've tried to really tie it into the existing workflow of the systematic review. And in the beginning, we actually debated organizing, we created a whole LibGuide, which we then deleted, where we had organized it around the stages of the systematic review rather than the sections of the DMP assistant. And then we realized that was too confusing. But within each section, first of all, we've linked to other tools that systematic reviewers use, the checklists and the protocols, so that as they're organizing those things, they can be working to also plan their data management. And then within each section, so for data collection, we have linked it to the sections of the systematic review. So, you know, things that you need to think about saving your protocol in a particular file format. When you collect your data, exporting your database results to RAS files to save them and manage them. So we've sort of tried to crosswalk it between the sort of flow that someone does in a systematic review versus the sections of the DMP assistant. So this is a little bit, less. And we've linked in, you know, some guidance on data management for particular types of files, but we've really tried to make it specific to the exact files that you would be working with as a reviewer. So, and trying to cover all the bases. So like if you're doing a qualitative synthesis, your in vivo files, and just sort of helping them. So if anything was sufficiently in here, we didn't add it to the LibGuide, but the LibGuide really does have extra information, all the extra stuff that we wish we had known when we started out. So even things like, here's an example naming convention for, you know, the files exported from databases, for your saved searches on database platforms, for the PDF full texts of included studies, and then all these different phases. Just want to look at really the last few sections are pretty similar to any other DMP, but documentation and metadata, again, something that isn't very well done in a systematic review, and we really wanted to improve the practices around that. So really laying it out that you need to, for instance, describe all of your search strategies, which is not something, you will not find this outside of Cochrane database right now. Many peer-reviewed systematic reviews published in journals have very bad reporting of how they actually collected their data, and it's not reproducible at all. If you're lucky, they reproduce the exact strategy from Medline or whatever else their core database was, and then just say that it has been translated to other databases. So we really wanted to encourage people to save all their search strategies, put them in a repository, describe them well with metadata, and we found this amazing article for developing a coding scheme for meta-analysis. And again, you can save all your coding sheets and your data dictionaries. So I think probably that's enough to give people the general idea of how we took a very generic template and customized it to a particular method. I want to say that because even though we have 2 official languages, most of us don't speak them both very fluently, so my French is pretty bad. Although the template itself will be translated into French, our LibGuide is in English only, but we did run it through Google Translate. I do have some rusty French. It looked pretty okay to me. And then we ran the French back through Google Translate into English again, and I think it was pretty decent. So that is something that people can do. And of course, we would be very happy if a Francophone librarian wanted to create their own LibGuide based on the template as well. And that is it for me.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather. So if anybody has questions for our speakers, there are already some in the Q&A, but go ahead and put them in there now, and remember to put which speaker your question is for. So the first one is for Heather. It's a question that came in over Discord. Will the systematic review template also be in DMP tool?
I think probably not, because we developed it specifically for the DMP assistant. So it will be on Zenodo. And I will share the URL of the LibGuide. Whoops. Just a second. I'll throw that in the chat as well. So as soon as we have it up on Zenodo, I will definitely add the link to Zenodo to our LibGuide. And I'm just going to throw that in there.
Thank you. There were a number of questions asking about the link for the LibGuide. So
That's the link to the metadata section, but you can just click on home to get back to the main page.
Okay. Next question is for Desi. Someone's asking if you could share the DOI for your study.
Sorry, I was just trying to do that, and I think I clicked something like answer live, and I can't type it anymore. I will put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
It's also on the slides, but I will put it in the chat.
Okay. Let's see. LibGuide. Heather, there's another question here from Beth Nazuk. Is the LibGuide pub?
I see it. Yeah, is the LibGuide published with a CCO license? You know what? I should put that on there. That's something that I think we meant to do and forgot.
Okay. Let's see. Are there, I think we've answered most of the, oh, here we go. This question is for Maya from Tuskernick. Do you see similar crosswalks between the FAIR principles and the other repository standards besides the core trust seal?
Okay, sorry. Yeah. I'm not familiar with any work that would be focused now on the second two that I was mentioning, so the Nestor seal and the
I think you may have
more detailed. This is just more in detail there. So it's sorry.
You froze for a little while there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, my connection. I see it. It's a bit unstable. Is it okay now?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, so I was saying that, of course, there is a connection between the other repository standards, the two that I was mentioning, so the Nestor seal and the ISO. Of course, it is just the more detailed and more thorough requirements that a repository needs to fulfill in order to get this certification. And of course, all of the FAIR principles are within all of these requirements. So there is really a really big overlap of the FAIR principle and all the certification standards, I think. So if that answers your question.
Thank you. We have another question from Amy Schuler to Desi or any of the speakers. Do you think metadata that is not highly structured, such as ecological metadata language or Dublin Core, is fair? Or any comments do you have on data silos?
Sorry, I was just wondering whether maybe the question was to Maya. I am thinking what my thoughts on this would be.
Well, if I can answer while you're thinking about it, I would say that yeah, not highly structured metadata would not be really fair, because the point of fair data is that you have really rich metadata describing a data set, which means also incorporating different control vocabularies within the domain of the data set. And I think that in order to be fair, you need to have this rich metadata structure, which also goes back to having some provenance data of the data set and all the methodological metadata of the data set and all other possible metadata that are out there. So I think that definitely high structure would be the way to go to achieve actual fairness.
Okay, Heather, we have one other question for you. An anonymous attendee asks, I think of DMP plans as a component of a funding proposal. This seems like an interesting use of the DMP structure to generate a systematic plan in and of itself without proceeding to a funding proposal. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in Canada, I think we're a little bit behind, certainly NIH, where we're still waiting on our funding agencies to put out their requirements for DMPs as part of a funding proposal. We're expecting that, I guess, kind of any day now. So we've been trying to, or at least I have always tried to say that the DMP is part of your overall project management plan. Like, it's not just for your funding agency, it's also for you. And certainly as someone who's worked on a systematic review, on a number of systematic reviews, and started out really not managing my data at all, a decade ago, this was kind of meant to address the things that I have encountered where it's like, oh, now I have to redo this and I didn't keep very good documentation of how I did it. So I think it can be both. And probably is more useful to the researcher if it is both. Obviously, you can write something much more skeletal than all of this just to make your funders happy.
Okay, I think that is the end of the questions, unless anybody else is still typing. I guess that is it for this panel. So thank you to our presenters and to everyone in the audience for participating in the session. And we'll see you again at the sessions tomorrow.